You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too. Now added bonus for free. Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. The next thing that we're going to do, as I promised, is Dave McGowan's Program to Kill. An excellent book. I actually did read it. See my notes as proof. So we're going to talk about the alternate theories that are possible when it comes to so-called serial killers. And this is what Dave McGowan presents in the book, is a different thesis as to how it is and why it is there was this explosion, post-Manson, into the 70s and 80s of the serial killer phenomena, which then seemed to transition in the 90s into movies at Hollywood. It became a Hollywood thing. And you had all these serial killer obsessed film theories and plots. You had all of these serial killer plots, but where were all the actual serial killers, right, from the 90s on into today? Not that many that we hear about, at least in the news, right? So where did all the serial killers go? Well, Dave's going to give his analysis of several of the important serial killers from the last several years and what was probably going on with these guys. What Dave's going to do is offer a lot of alternative evidence that is ignored by mainstream media and maybe the standard stories that you hear about these serial killers. And we're also going to get into the MKUltra project and its potential connection to the Phoenix program, which is also a book by Doug Valentine that we will probably discuss in the near future as well. But for Dave's thesis, what he's going to propose is that when you look at the military connections of the MKUltra program, and this was, of course, the programs throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s that were known for experimentation into hypnosis, experimentation into truth serums, the stuff that you've probably seen in movies and films, but the real research, of course, has been delved into pretty in-depth by other writers like John Marks in his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. And we've covered that book at Jay's Analysis. Dave's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, the Laurel Canyon scene, we've covered that as well, and that deals with MKUltra. And of course, this book is going to deal with it. And what he's going to propose is that because of these many military connections, and in fact that many of the top serial killers had these military intelligence and CIA type connections, contract killer connections, that there's a good possibility that we can look back to something like the Phoenix program and see that was probably connected to the MKUltra program. And then by extension, that the serial killer phenomenon might have actually been a U.S. domestic manifestation of perhaps these guys coming back from their overseas service or being programmed at various clinics through what we see with Dr. Ewan Cameron and the MKUltra programs, Jose Delgado, Jolly and West, all these figures that we've seen so long in so-called conspiracy circles be mentioned, but are actually really and truthfully doctors, psychiatrists, right, who were running the real MKUltra programs. So that's the beginning setting for what Dave's writing about. And this is 2004, so this is prior to things like the BTK killer. So that's another guy, by the way, who is not in Dave's book, but had this pedigree of military and killer type background. And that's really, I think it makes a lot more sense than the homegrown killer, right? Which is what we're taught is really going on with people like Manson or these kind of characters, that they're these just random products of a bad upbringing or abuse or something like this. And another aspect to this that the mainstream media rarely touches, except maybe in the Manson case, I'll kind of talk a little bit about cults, is that Dave's going to dive pretty deep into research done by other characters like Maury Terry in The Ultimate Evil that maybe there were actually more powerful networks and cults in the background behind people like Berkowitz, people like Henry Lee Lucas, people like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and Manson, right? So something beyond the process church even. I'm not just talking about a cult. I'm talking about, people with kind of these deep state, dark, black side of the black ops world, right? Who have a vested interest in maybe using someone like a psychopathic killer in the case where you might need to have a hit. A professional contract killer can have somebody offed. And Dave's thesis is going to be, of course, in part that maybe what happens in some of these cases, and he's going to give some evidence, it's not just thesis, but if police have, say, an unsolved crime in certain districts, right? He's not saying this is everywhere in every police district in the U.S. He's just saying in certain states where you've had the problem of the so-called serial killers, which tends to be, for whatever reason, probably connected to Mexico and drugs and whatnot. Florida, Texas, and California are the main regions where these serial killers just pop up. And, obviously California is like a big one, right? You have a whole bunch of serial killers that have had their reign of terror, all right, out in California. So the first thing, though, that he sets it up is the whole idea of the pedophiles in government, which is interesting because Dave is no longer around, unfortunately. But in 2004, he was writing about this tendency of these sickos and Satanists and pedophiles who do seem to occupy, the important levers of power in various states and in various corporations and so forth. And so that's where he sees that being connected, because it's kind of he's painting a picture of the cultural decline that's also related to the rise of the serial killers, right? You have the 60s revolution, which in Weird Scenes Inside Laurel Canyon, he argued was really fostered and aided and abetted by the establishment, right? Like these characters were given record deals, they were given a lot of promotion, a lot of attention, so that suggests that there was some degree of coordination and that they were propelled to stardom, the specific Laurel Canyon people like the Doors, Mamas and Papas, etc., for a reason. And so in the same way, he's going to point out the odd connections behind a lot of the serial killers, right? In a similar way to how many of the Laurel Canyon bands and so-called artists had all these deep state military family, military intelligence connections. In the same way, Dave's going to say that a lot of these serial killers seem to have this same pattern, and that fits with the idea, with the notion that they would have been part of, as we said, perhaps the Phoenix program or something akin to it, or something like the MK Ultra program, right? We think of Ted Kaczynski. He had a stint where he volunteered at Harvard to participate in MK Ultra experiments. That was actually in his obituary in, I believe, the LA Times or New York Times. You can go look that up. But yes, he was actually a willing participant in MK Ultra research. So if you're wondering why you get this sort of crazed guy out in the woods who's warning of the tech takeover, a long time ago, and we're told that he's the one who's bombing the, maybe actually I'll do my the Unabomber. I was actually thinking about doing a full unibrow, and then I would have called it the Unibrow Bomber. I may still do that skit. That sounds like a lot of fun. But remember these pictures that you saw of this guy in the 90s, and he would just be like up on the TV, and they're saying, "Oh, that's the Unabomber," and we know because he sends in these bombs, and he's gonna bomb all these planes. That sounds like a bunch of bullshit to me, but who knows? Maybe this guy was really just totally off his rocker, or maybe he was just living off the grid and they chose a patsy. But that's going to be another theme, right? The Unabomber report. That's going to be another theme in Dave's book, is the idea of when the police departments are needing to clear up some unsolved cases, maybe they stack them onto the so-called serial killer or the professional hit killer, and then voila, right? Serial killer XYZ with three names. It's always three names. Bobby Lee Long, right? He's got 200 kills, which is hard to believe, but maybe some of those were actually just stacked on unsolved crimes. The other important aspect to what Dave talks about is the notion of the serial killer phenomenon being social engineering. That what it had a tendency to do was make everybody very, very afraid of public venues or going out or letting your kids play, this kind of stuff, and that it atomized society because everybody got this false impression, which wasn't actually true, that there were millions of serial killers out there everywhere, right? Millions of Unabombers everywhere, right? This is kind of the same with the war on terror, right? This domestic version of this, that there's just these sickos just everywhere, and that's not actually true, right? There are certain cases where this appears to be true, and these people oftentimes have these very strange connections to, hardcore military killer family members, etc. Maybe they trained them, or they were involved in some sort of cult activity. So I'll stop being the Unabomber there, but so maybe, in a lot of these cases we see that the serial killers happen to be multiple personality people. And what's neat is that Dave notes that the chief deniers of multiple personality dissociative identity disorder were actually the CIA people who were at the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which is a CIA-funded disinformation outlet that was intended to debunk any idea of ritual abuse. And then so the FBI and these different law enforcement entities would go to these experts who would then tell them, oh, there's no such thing as this satanic ritual abuse. That's all made up. Right, so that's just made up, right? It's sensationalism. There's no real networks or ritual abuse or something like that. So Dave covers all that, which is really interesting. And this is, of course, I think what I may start doing is instead of the full hour, do these 15-minute summaries, because people are a lot more willing to share 15-minute things than they are 45-minute, 1 hour things, which for the listeners, you're still going to get the subscribers, you're still going to get the full experience where we will talk about the totality of the book in the review and the analysis. And of course, I'm always going to recommend that people go buy the actual book. My analysis and review is not a substitute. It's just a survey in the same way that we might discuss any work of literature or something like that. So you're going to see that a lot of these serial killers have high-level political connections. Why would that be? Why would Rosalind Carter, right, the first lady, be meeting with John Wayne Gacy, right? And this is photos of this. This is a famous picture, which I didn't know about until I heard Dave, give some interviews and talk about his book. And then when I read the book, I was just like, yeah, you can find this online. Why would Ted Bundy be, working adamantly for the Nelson Rockefeller campaign, right? He's very interested. I'm not saying that he knew him per se. I don't know about that, but why is he kind of this rising GOP guy, right? And Dave's talked about that a lot in interviews. So we're going to see a lot of cults are going to tie into mobs. And this is something I've talked about a lot at Jay's analysis, and they're going to tie into intelligence agencies. And then, so we're starting to see the architecture of the criminal networks and how they work, and the power structure, how it works, and so forth. And now they use these people, and what they do is they will profile for the psychos. And then a psycho is useful, right? What can we do with this psycho guy, right? What use would Manson perhaps be? What use would Berkowitz perhaps be? So the psychos are put to the system's use, right? And that's not to say that there aren't psychos. They are. You see, these are the people who actually were abused. A lot of them were child prostitutes. They were prostituted out. They were molested. A lot of them, their parents, their mom was a prostitute, and who would make them watch. In the case of Henry Lee Lucas. And so obviously this guy's damaged, right? So that's what's happened to a lot of these guys. And then they become dissociated, right? They have these alternate states, and even Dave is willing to kind of give the possibility or halfway admit in some sections of the book, maybe these they're also kind of possessed, right? So they're not just splits, alternate identities. They might also have spiritual problems and possession, and I think that's the most logical analysis too. So you've been listening to Jay's analysis, and next, if you want to see the full analysis of Dave's book, where we look at a lot of these cases of the serial killers and their alternate personalities and Dave's totality argument and thesis. You need to subscribe to Jay's analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. You can also get my book, Esoteric Hollywood Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, signed at my website. And thank you for watching, and get ready to get into some pretty dark, nasty stuff, but it's illustrative. It's interesting, and it reminds me again of the Shyamalan movie Split, right? I mean, I know that's Hollywood, but if you watched Split, it's very reminiscent of what we read in Programmed to Kill. Now we move to the actual text and what Dave argues in the book. And he mentions the importance of mind control. And this is something that we've talked about many times. We've done a lot of interviews, a lot of talks, a lot of discussions on the reality of mind control and how it would be useful in many different fields. Marketing would be interested in this. Psychology would be interested in this. Intelligence agencies, military, you name it, all would be interested. Cults, right? So all of these various aspects of our crazy world could have some potential use for mind control. And so you can see why, with the development of all the scientific techniques since the scientific revolution, as to why this would be such an important focus of study. And the government, especially our government, especially in the last 50, 60, 70 years, has poured tremendous money into this. And as we said, that was documented in John Marx's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which you can get that book as well. It will be in the recommended reading page as I update that in the next couple days. Jay's analysis. And I also have my review and analysis of that book. Now, some of these books that he's mentioned we're probably familiar with. He mentions Acid Dreams. He mentions Journey into Madness. Delgado's book, Physical Control of the Mind, one of the MK Ultra doctors who actually wrote a book on physical control of the mind. Donald Bain's book, Control of Candy Jones, and her usage by the military. And we have Walter Bowert's pretty well-known book, Operation Mind Control. Peter Watson, War on the Mind. Peter Schrag, Mind Control. So all these books are pretty good. I've read several of these, but they're pretty, not all of them, but they're pretty good introductions to the notion of mind control. And when it comes to the issue of MPD and DID, multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, this is supposed to be debated, but the consensus of a lot of the supposed academic literature is that it's not faked. Dr. Deirdre Barrett, writing in 2001 for Psychology Today, noted that they are not faking it. There are other references. The DSMV still, I've cited this in articles as well. Not that this proves anything per se, but it's interesting that you have these establishment papers that still cite it as legitimate, as a real thing. The DSMV citing Esther Brooks's famous hypnosis article. And that's still in the footnotes last time I checked a year or two ago. So still referenced. And Dr. Colin Ross, you've probably heard him in various on various podcast talks, interviews. I've heard him on several different psychiatry and psychology podcasts, which I listen to quite a few of those here and there in my spare time. So this is not a subject that is completely new to me. I've also read other books just strictly from the psychiatry, psychological standpoint. Switching Time by Bayer. We mentioned that in the interview that I did with Greg Crawwood at Higher Side Chats. So there's a lot of literature out there that you can find that tends to back this up. And so that's part of the thesis that Dave's going to work from. And I would agree. I think it's real. And there's other books too. that will deal with it maybe from a more conspiratorial perspective. I've got some more poppy books in my library that touch on mind control and MKUltra, but they're really kind of referencing the founding text that we've already mentioned. So, as we noted from John Marks's book, we don't know everything about what happened in MKUltra, and supposedly Helms, or one of the CIA guys, destroyed 7 boxes, and somebody only got a hold of 7 boxes that weren't destroyed, and all this kind of stuff. Who knows what's true in regard to that? But I think we can kind of trace out general ideas, and some of the documents are online. I've looked through some of those. It's hard to tell what you're looking at, but Freud apparently was aware of this idea of ritual abuse and sexual ritual abuse. He may have been involved in it, I don't know, but it's at least mentioned in Freud's work. And so again, you've got these mad scientists, basically, is what I argued in the John Marks talk. Who knows what, they're going to be doing anything and everything just because they are wicked dudes. There's a quote from Probe magazine, which I've never heard of, but Dave cites this as a woman, Arlene Tyler, and she's writing about MKUltra, and she says, in the 50s, the CIA was also looking for specially gifted subjects to study their dissociative states. So I'm guessing this means gifted children, although I'm not 100% sure. This could be induced and controlled through hypnosis and drugs. It reminds me of that Netflix series, The OA. Remember that? The OA. If you saw that, which was really good until that stupid ending. I was really hooked on that show. I was like, man, this is, I've never seen anything like this. And then it just turned into Glee or something. It's like Glee meets Sandy Hook at the end. If you saw that, if you didn't see it, I can't say that I recommend it just because it was such a stupid ending. But if you are into endings, then you'll enjoy. If you're really into the first 3/4 of shows, you'll like that show. Now, blackmail, orgies, eyes wide shut stuff, Mark Dutroux affair, that all comes up. We've talked about that many times. That's why I did, my analysis of Eyes Wide Shut, which is in my book, the first chapter, actually. And it's interesting that Dave mentions the many times, the many instances, many cases where you have a connection between the timing of events and various occult calendars. So Dave notes that. I think there's something to that. And he mentions some cults here at the beginning where the Belgian elite and elite Roman Catholics in Belgium, yeah, we know that. We talked about that many times as well, in relation again to the Dutroux affair and the character of Michael Nahul, who was one of these guys who would, I guess, grab girls and supplied these girls for the elite. And there was like this pedo cult, and the guy who takes the fall is Dutroux, if I recall, right? He's the guy who's supposed to be in charge of all this, but then, like the whole city of Belgium, there's like a huge march at the Capitol because people are so outraged over this, and it was so widespread. And so something like 1 million people marched because this was all covered up. And then he talks about pedophile cults in Scotland, in Portugal. There was a big TV guy called Mr. TV, I guess, in Portugal, and he was involved in this giant pedophile cult. And there was this snuff films, interestingly, we've mentioned that in some cases, being covered. Now, Snopes tells you that there's no such thing. So that's supposed to be, I guess, the definitive word on whether or not snuff films exist. But Yeah, I mean, come on. There people have cameras and there are evil people. Why wouldn't they exist, right? And what is this that we hear about on the internet? Rule 34, that if you can think of it, there's some kind of weird porn version, right? Whatever you can think of, there's some weirdo that's into the porn version of that. Anyway, Dave mentions Lewis Carroll. We've talked about Lewis Carroll as well and his pedophilia, and it's how it kind of seems to be affiliated with Alice in Wonderland in some way, although I guess it's not 100% certain, but you could argue maybe that, you know, Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole and all of her experience, her trippy experiences. I mean, maybe Lewis Carroll was like drugging girls or something, and, you know, this is how he got the idea for this, right? So the dissociative states and young girls being traumatized, and maybe this is part of the meaning of Wonderland, right? And the weird connections with Disney. This becomes sort of the motif of Disney, right? You know, it's hard to demonstrate. I only found one instance where in John Marx's book there was a direct connection between Alice in Wonderland and MK Ultra, and it was Ewan Cameron had been doing experiments on a certain woman. I don't remember her name, but she was in one of the psychiatric hospitals, and, you know, he was like playing all these weird things and psychic driving and torturing and electroshock and playing these tapes and I guess movies. We don't really know, but he was probably strapping her down and making her watch, you know, like Alice in Wonderland or something. I don't know, or maybe playing it on Alice in Wonderland on tape and seeing what that would do. And but she seems to think that this woman that he was, you know, dosing up with LSD and he's doing all this too, she thought that she was Alice in Wonderland. So that is the one instance I could find that connects Alice in Wonderland directly to the actual programs of MK Ultra. But I suppose the allegory, maybe it's kind of like a wink wink thing amongst sickos that, oh yeah, that's about, you know, Lewis Carroll's into young girls, and that's what Alice in Wonderland's about. But I'm not sure. I don't know. But one of the theses that Dave lays out is that, as we said, there are unsolved murders, and a lot of these unsolved murders could be tacked on to a supposed serial killer, right? Now, that's not to say that the serial killers aren't serial killers, but rather that they may have killed a few people, and then it's added on to their hit count, right? All of these other names of people that they supposedly killed, right? Or that the police department couldn't make sense of, or, you know, old cases that were unsolved. So then he moves on to talk about instances of, you know, like pedo cults, and this is very prescient because of all the stuff that, you know, has come out in the news in the last, 13 years since Dave published this book, right? I mean, we've seen so many instances of this, and he mentions the McMartin preschool case, which, if you've seen, you know, Ted Gunderson's lecture, which has been going around the internet for, I don't know, probably 20 years since the beginning of the internet, but I don't know. But Dave argues that, you know, there's a lot of questions in the McMartin case that were never answered, so we could there were tunnels under the school, right? So, you know, that was not a mythology, right? But I guess it's not definitive, and depending on what you think of Ted Gunderson and his talk, you know, who knows? But Dave seems to think that there's oddities in that case that leave it still open for question. And then he moves on to talk about other instances of drugging and capturing and drugging children. And this reminded me of, and this is a character named Frank Fuster, and this is just like the movie Prisoners. Now, I'm not positive, but whoever made the movie Prisoners with Jake Gyllenhaal and Wolverine, whatever. I've gone blank. Oh, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I know who it is, but my mind is on Frank Fuster at the moment, which is a ridiculous name. But Frank would go into a trance, and he would steal kids, and just a total sicko. But what was interesting is that he would use Gatorade, urine, and drugs. This is how he would drug his victims. And, of course, he touched them and molested them and all this kind of stuff. And that is one of these cases where, yeah, he says a catatonic trance. Interesting. And I guess he was connected to working at Disney or something like that. This is... Dave says, even so, justice was not necessarily served, blah, blah, blah. Not even the Santeria priest who attended the trial with Fuster's mother and uncle had the power to save him. And Arvida, which is to say the Walt Disney Company, paid $6 million to 7 of his victims. So he was one of these weird pedo guys. Then Dave goes on to talk about routes of trafficking and how this might be connected to moving contraband, be it people or whatever. And he talks about, I think he mentions Air America. And a lot of, I assumed everyone had seen this, but I guess not, because I mentioned it and people don't know what I'm talking about. But there's a movie about the CIA airline Air America. It's got Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. in it. So I assumed everybody had seen that, but I guess not. So go watch Air America if you want to see, like, here's total revelation of the method. Oh yeah, this CIA, traffics drugs in this private CIA airline, and it's called Air America. And everybody knows this. There's a hilarious comedy about it. It's like, what? People, I don't know. It's crazy. The world that we live in is so crazy. And you can have all these movies made about all this stuff. Movies made about the serial killers too, right? I mean, again, Prisoners. And I listed a bunch of movies that came to mind because I was thinking about comparing the Hollywood presentations with what Dave talks about. And, I don't know. It's just so... This is just such a bizarre genre. It's such a weird thing that serial killers pops up all of a sudden. But we're going to see why that is as we get into Dave's book. So he moves on to talk about some other creeper instances of mind control facilities. This is something I've wondered about too, is these locations for where these programming and so such might go down. And I've wondered about this, and Dave lists a lot of locales and places and potential things. Locations observed: London, Germany, Bahamas, Japan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Africa, Costa Rica, Europe. There are areas in Palestine under various project names, and this is connected to the Finders case. The Finders case is this idea of where they were trafficking kids that were being kidnapped, and this was under I believe the CIA's proprietary firm that was Air America is the proprietary firm, the proprietary airline, and the Finders were supposed to be looking for lost children. Well, it doesn't look like they were looking for them. It looks like they were selling them, because they had apparently cash machines set up for wired transfers, across across continents and countries. And this ties into Craig Spence and Larry King and the now famous Franklin cover-up. So if you have read the Franklin cover-up book, then you know all about that. And I'm sure most people have probably seen the Discovery Channel documentary that has also been floating around the internet for 20 years, about Franklin cover-up. So we won't rehearse all that, but the next character is Henry Lee Lucas. And what's interesting about the Henry Lee Lucas case is the connection to a mysterious cult, or so Henry claims. Now, again, we don't know if this is true. This is in Henry's, whoever the biographer was, and I went and looked up the link to check it, and it is there. He does say it in the whatever the authorized biography of Henry Lee Lucas is, or his main biographer. It's called Hand of Death: The Henry Lee Lucas Story. And Hand of Death is the name of the cult that he claims he was controlled by or a part of. And it supposedly has connections to Texas Rangers. I don't know if that's true. I'm just saying that this is what Henry Lee Lucas claimed. Now, again, it's hard to prove these things or know these things because they are coming from crazy dudes, right? So now it doesn't mean that it's false just because it comes from a crazy dude, right? But it's just, again, dubious and hard to know. So, who knows? But there are all these oddities that come up, like, why does this crazy dude get pardoned by W? But W, I'm gonna pardon Henry Lee Lucas. He's a good man. He's a good man. The mustard gases, the terrorists, right? Now, why would you pardon this guy if you're W, right? I mean, I don't know. That's bizarre, but Henry claims that he was part of a cult that had connections, interestingly, to a ranch in Mexico near Juarez. Now, I've been in a few arguments lately with people about Juarez because last summer I drove to California, and on the way we stopped in El Paso. And El Paso's on the border of Juarez, and the reason this became interesting to me initially was because of the movie Sicario. And if you watch Sicario, you'll see Emily Blunt get duped by the CIA guy played by I'm going blank on my actors today. Goonies. I don't know. I'm usually like spot on with my actors, but I don't know. I've been reading and talking all day. Josh Brolin is the CIA dude who dupes Emily Blunt. If you haven't seen Sicario, go watch that. That's relevant to this because you've got your contract killers, your hitmen, and that as well. Played by Benicio del Toro. So, the Mexican death cult of MS-13, which I've talked about and looked into, and the religious worship of Santa Muerte, and these gangs, I think that's all real. And you have these long-standing stories of the disappearing women. So in Juarez, all these women disappear, and wonder what's going on. Nobody can figure it out. Well, they're being put into human trafficking. It's obvious what's going on. Come on. So Dave wrote about this a long time ago, and then so I went and looked, and there's all these articles and videos and documentaries that you can find on the cartels of Juarez and the Sinaloa and all these different areas down there, and what cartel controls what region, and on and on and on. And when I was driving through there, I was looking actually at the government alert page just out of curiosity, and they tell you, don't go here, you can go here, this one's okay, don't go over here. I'm not saying the government's necessarily reliable, but I'm saying that I don't think that's fake. I mean, there are cartels that control these places, and when you go to El Paso, you can stand on the El Paso side and you can look over, which we did. I took pictures, And Juarez is just this long, never-ending, infinite plain up the hill, up this mountain with writing on it, right? Something about, I guess it says like Jesus and Juarez or something. I can't remember. But it's just all these like shanties, right? Very sad. I'm not trying to be cruel or dismissive or harsh or insensitive, but it's just really bad news. It's a lot of poverty, and it's obvious. So the people that are trying to argue with me that it's not a shithole, they're just full of it. I've seen it. Don't pull your liberal crap with me, because I went and saw it with my own eyes. I've been to Mexico too, by the way. I've been to Tijuana. And so anyway, but what's interesting is that we start to get a picture. And if you go read even liberal magazines, what's as funny is I went to all the liberal publications, like all of the pro open border ones. Like I was reading the Atlantic and and their because I was curious, because I wanted to see what the leftists and the feminists would say about missing women in Juarez. That's a bit of a conundrum for the leftist feminists, because you don't want to be racist against the Hispanic and I guess the noble cartel people, right? You don't want to be racist if you say that there are cartels, but you also don't want to ignore the plight of trafficked women. So that's kind of a tough one. So I think it was the Atlantic article that I read, pretty long one about the missing women. Well, it just says, oh yeah, this is all true. There's always missing women, and in the 90s or somewhere in that period, it was the most missing women in the world and all this stuff, and we got to do something about this, and why there's no government to do anything because of NAFTA. Now, I think that's all true. NAFTA is private corporate sweatshops that are put down there on purpose, and so all the cops down there are like bought off, right, by all the cartels. So I think that's how all this works. If you want to be liberal and debate me on that, and you think that there is no MS-13 and there's no Santa Muerte, and well, all these documentaries that are on YouTube, they're not all fake. Have you been to Mexico? I have, right? So there's good and bad areas. And if you don't think there's bad areas, then you're just lying. Now, but was Henry Lee Lucas raised in a Hand of the Devil death cult? I don't know. We don't know, but that is what he says. And there's I forget the exact number, but there's a really high death count, right? And it's hard to see that he was really behind all this. So Dave goes on to say, well, Henry is probably a portrait of the MK Ultra type assassin that we're talking about, who could be used for multiple reasons. And so there's this Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI connection, and the argument is that the ONI and NATO were interested in finding prisoners and sickos. And so this is how we get the connection to the Phoenix program, which is this idea out of Vietnam, where William Colby said, in order to defeat all the commies and the Viet Cong, we've got to train ruthless psychopaths, right? And so this is where you get the idea, like in Full Metal Jacket, right? This is the same idea there, where the big, goofy, kind of retarded dude at the beginning just goes nuts because he just goes psycho, right? And this is basically Apocalypse Now. This is Martin Sheen going crazy on acid, right? So that's kind of that's what the Phoenix program is. There you go, Apocalypse Now. Now, so there's all these CIA scoundrels, Dan Mitrione, and these characters that are connected to this Phoenix program, into William Colby. And the thesis here is that, it looks like these are probably some of the guys who either came back from Vietnam and were traumatized and psychopaths, or they were profiled beforehand and put into Vietnam to become the program psychopath. And by the way, if you go watch Full Metal Jacket, the Kubrick film, you'll notice the William Baldwin, whatever, the Baldwin guy in it, I forget his name, but he's the psycho, right? And you have Joker, the main character, who after the first scene, after the first act, when the big goofy retarded dude commits suicide, it moves into the Vietnam section of the story, and then Joker meets the Baldwin character, Adam Baldwin, and the actor. And Adam Baldwin is just total psycho, man. He just loves the kill count. He loves all the different ways to kill people. And then when at the climax of the film, if you recall, it's this little, 13, 14-year-old Viet Cong girl, and she's the one who's like secretly shooting them from a building top, right? And so they sneak into the building, they get up to the top, and Joker shoots her, but she's not dead. And so it's Joker and Adam Baldwin and the rest of the team are standing up there, and they don't know what to do. And Adam Baldwin's like, just kill her. He has absolutely no remorse of killing this little kid. And Joker doesn't want to, but finally he just goes with it. And, he's obviously very troubled, in having to do this, which any normal person would be, having to kill a 13-year-old. But this, for the Baldwin guy, whatever his character's name is, he loves it, right? So he's that 1% that's the psychopath. And that's what Dave's getting at, is that these kind of people were profiled. And isn't that interesting that that's kind of what, again, Kubrick appears to be telling us in so many ways. He's told us so many things. And this is where we move into Berkowitz and the connections to other cults. The Satanic Family is what Berkowitz claims, that he was connected to this larger satanic network, Satanic Family. This is where Maury Terry's book, Ultimate Evil, has the thesis that Manson and Berkowitz and some of these other guys, Henry Lee Lucas, that they appear to have been part of a larger national or international network of cults that were run by a super cult or just run by military and intelligence, right? And could therefore be used for assassinations, for hits, for whatever, kidnapping, and so forth. Then he talks about the monster. This is one I'd never heard of, the Monster of Florence. And I've read, several books, probably 10 books on occult crimes and so forth. I'd never heard of the Monster of Florence, and this is a dude in a circle of elite guys, and maybe women too, in Italy in the period of the 70s and 80s. In 2002, I've been maybe into the 2000s. 2002, the Monster of Florence was in the news again. Yeah, satanic rites, according to the Sunday Herald. Eyes wide shut parties. This is page 84 in Dave's book. The police are involved. There's orgies. They've got cameras. They've got torture racks. They are blackmailing people. That was what was going on. So this is the upper level Italian elites. So we're starting to see patterns here. This is going on like everywhere. Like all the countries, these elites are into just the grossest stuff, and then you realize, oh, a big part of it is blackmailing people, right? And this is what you do. You get photographic evidence, you've got film evidence of these people doing outrageous stuff, and then you can control them that way. Now, that also makes me think of, and I've looked into this a little bit, but I haven't done a whole lot of research, but it's supposed to be partly true, this story that is the Guy Ritchie movie Bank Job. And if you remember, if you haven't seen that, I recommend it. I don't usually, I'm not a big fan of Jason. I don't have any problem with Jason Statham. It's just I'm not really into like the standard action movies. But Bank Job is a really good Jason Statham movie. Killer Elite's really good too, by the way. But in Bank Job, if you recall, I'm not going to spoil the end for you, but MI6 hires like the best bank thieves on the down low, and they hire them to steal, blackmail evidence of one of the nobility or the royal princess or something like that, I think. Somebody royal who was doing some nasty orgy stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if that isn't true. And one of the guys who had the blackmail was one of these, like, not Malcolm X, but I think they call him Micah X or something ridiculous. No, not Micah X, that's the guy. That was the guy who killed people supposedly in Denver. One of these X guys, like a black rights, black nationalist guy. So-and-so X. Who, by the way, was a real guy, I think. I can't remember who it's based on, but anyway, go watch Bank Job. It's a pretty good movie. So, chapter 9, we go to Rancho Diablo, which is more on the Henry Lee Lucas thing, because Henry Lee Lucas talked about the connections to satanic cult in Juarez, which presumably would tie into MS-13 and the Santa Muerte. And in chapter 9, Dave talks about a different cult, which I had heard of, but I didn't know much about this. So this was also new to me. Around 1989, you had the Matamoros cult, and they were just south of Brownsville, Texas. And Henry Lee Lucas had a spiritual advisor from the Matamoros cult. Unbelievable. Clemmy Schroeder, identified as Henry's spiritual advisor. And I guess she had some connection to the Matamoros cult, but Henry's partner, Otis Toole, claimed that it was not the specific ranch, not the same one, but that there were interconnected operations all along the Texas-Mexico border. Now that's crazy. Anyway, so the Matamoros cult was headed by connected to a drug baron named Elio Hernandez Rivera, and obviously, of course, they bought off cops. Some of them were into, it's like a witchcraft cult, just really crazy stuff. And they were first exposed in 1989 for a series of brutal murders that included beheadings. And Dave says that they were involved in not just murder, but also drug trafficking. And the pipeline went from the Matamoros cult, south of Brownsville, to the mob in Chicago. Interesting. Let's see, who's the guy in this? The high priestess, Sarah Aldrete, displayed what was described as split personality. She clearly had a dual personality. Like many of the other occultists, Aldrete had married on Halloween 1983. She had links to the Hernandez drug family. Blah, blah, blah. The Matamoros cult was part of a massive hemisphere-wide drug trafficking network that went all the way from Roswell, Texas to top Chicago mafia. I did not know any of that. That was all new to me. So then he talks about NAFTA and the missing women in Juarez, as I mentioned. And the reason for NAFTA and Mexico was so that there would be sweatshops, tax-free sweatshops, right? Free market, isn't it? Libertarian. So there's deep state connections, of course, to these cults. One guy named Dracula. One cult guy led by Jesus Guardado Marquez, known as El Dracula. And Dave notes, of course, which should be obvious, that these Mexican cults and the drug trafficking appeared to have been tied to the then president of Mexico. Not surprising. So there's a tie-in between the narco cults and Satanism. That is interesting. And I've wondered about that. Why do you see this weird connection between MS-13 and these Santeria cults and Santa Muerte with, and I guess it's just because cults, obviously, it's a natural affinity between the realm of mind control and MK Ultra sex slaves. I mean, this is like, I guess, should be obvious why those two worlds are connected. There's also, this chapter too, I'm not sure, I don't want to recommend this movie, but it reminds me of the Nicolas Cage movie 8mm, which I don't know, I guess it's any worse than Videodrome. If you've seen David Cronenberg's Videodrome, it's kind of the same idea, but a lot more weird than the Nicolas Cage movie. But what Dave talks about in chapter 9 with some of the usage of military base and different ranches and filming stuff and human trafficking, and it's just awful stuff. But I mean, that Nicolas Cage movie is so ridiculous that it's like, I don't know, the silliness of Nicolas Cage, the entertaining aspects of Nicolas Cage sort of dull the soften the blow of the harshness of the topic, I guess you could say. Whereas I guess if you watch Videodrome, it's just weird. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad movie, it's illustrative, but the only reason I haven't done an analysis yet of Videodrome is because I own it, I have the DVD, I've seen it probably 5 times. I'm still not 100% sure I know what David Cronenberg is trying to say in that movie. That we definitely live in the Videodrome, I know that much, but I don't know what he's talking about. Anyway, Lucas's cases don't fit his profile, and this is an interesting point that comes up in a lot of the serial killer stuff here that Dave says might suggest involved more killers. And this is the idea of totally different styles of murder, like bludgeoning and then beheading and then strangling, and so when it's this sort of randomness, yeah, it could be that the killer was just, super crafty and trying to outsmart the cops, but it also could be that these are just different people different murders, different cults, different groups, or all of them working together. So another interesting fact is the California, Texas, Florida connection. Why is it so many of these serial killers are drawn to, live in, grow up, or end up in terrorize these three states? Now, I mean, obviously other states come up in different cases, but these really seem to be a hotbed. And Dave says, well, it's because these are areas of trafficking out of Mexico. And that makes sense. The new terror fear begins, this is interesting, he says, with Charles Whitman. And this is the guy who, climbs up in the tower at University of Texas and he starts sniping people. Now this guy too was like a former intelligence dude. They're the Texas Sniper. Naval Enlisted Science Education Program, NESEP, was an intelligence entity. And from there he came back, went up the tower at the University of Texas, Austin, and just started sniping. And I forget what his body count is, 23 or 30. And this kind of spawns the idea that you're not safe anywhere. You know what I mean? That anywhere you go out in town, travel, I mean, there's just serial killers under every rock. There's a serial killer and, waiting to snipe you from atop every tower, right? Now that's not true, but the public began to get this impression. And so you kind of get the thesis, well, maybe there's more going on. Maybe, Dave's proposing the possibilities, he said in many later interviews, that, the serial killer thing didn't just serve the purposes of contract killings or professional hits or whatever, but it also might have served a larger social engineering dynamic that would result in atomization and alienation, people not letting their kids go out and play and this kind of stuff. And then from there, it kind of, they just die away. Like, where are all the serial killers? Last one I can even think of hearing about, and that's excluding, the normal murders in the news or whatever, but the BTK killer, right? Remember the BTK killer when he had some previous military intelligence pedigree? That was, when was BTK? You know what I mean? Like, that's early mid 2000s. So we've had like one serial killer since Dahmer, I guess. Like, who was the last famous serial killer that everybody heard of? We're not going to count OJ right here. I don't think he counts, but popular so-called serial killers, as this so-called profile goes, which Dave says is also kind of bogus. There's not really a profile. That's kind of a Hollywood thing, but isn't it interesting? This is what everybody sees, is, again, through the lens of Hollywood. Now, we've talked about this many times. Hollywood has given us the understanding of terror and the terrorist, right? Not facts, not actual real world debates and discussions and statistics of, how likely you are to be killed by terrorists, which is less likely than a bee sting. And the same with serial killers, right? I mean, if you watch movies, which obviously I have and you have, if we were to just take the movie world at face value, you would think half of the population are terrorists and serial killers. They're just everywhere. This is just simply not true. You know what I mean? Like, let's just assume that everything we're told about a Jeffrey Dahmer, okay? Let's just assume that that's real. Well, there's only one Jeffrey Dahmer in, what, a decade, right? But when the media props this stuff up, and I think John Adams has talked about this idea that the media can create the impression that something is everywhere and a lot more prevalent than it actually is. And that's a very powerful tool of social engineering, is that, you know, the media has this ability to give us the impression that there's all these terrorists, there's all these killers everywhere. It's just madness and mayhem everywhere. And that's just not true, right? Like the most crime-ridden cities, you know, like Chicago or Memphis or Houston, you know, they have, if you look up the stats, it's not murders every night. You know, maybe in Chicago there's a murder every night. You know, what do they have, like 300, 400, 500 murders a year? Now that's a lot of murders, but I'm saying, you know, it's not like if I drive 1 hour in any direction from where I live, for example, there might be one murder a year, you know, within a, I don't know, 100-mile span of where I live. So, you know, it's really confined to certain areas that this kind of stuff happens, and it's gang and drug stuff. And then sometimes there's the psycho, sometimes there's the guy that loses it, you know, sometimes there's the cult, this kind of stuff. But this stuff is not every day. So we can't let the media impress upon us unrealistic dangers. But that's really what they're there for, right? It's the real terrorists are the media. I've said for a long time. So then he goes on to talk about the alteration in culture with Anton LaVey and how Anton LaVey had you know, this kind of intelligence type connections, and you know, this is really touched on, well, it's dealt with in more detail in the other book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, where he focuses on the intelligence propping up and support for the Laurel Canyon scene, which was the real birthplace of the hippie movement, according to Dave McGowan. And we get some of the repeated stuff that, again, was new, you know, when this book came out, 2004, to readers probably, but to us, we all know about L. Ron Hubbard, and we all know about Crowley and Hubbard, you know, being part of the part of Scientology, or excuse me, part of the OTO and Crowley's group before he went into starting his own cult. So we're not going to rehearse all that, but there's these really weird connections between, well, the issue of the Zodiac, and Dave's idea is that probably multiple people in the case of the Zodiac, and these were done explicitly on, you know, cult calendar holidays like Lammas and Walpurgis Night and all this stuff. But the codes appear to have had an actual cryptographic reference that would have been known to people probably in the Office of Naval Intelligence. So that would suggest some kind of militarized, former military, you know, contract killers, this kind of thing. And citywide homicides reached 29 in 4 days, I believe, under the Zodiac. And Zodiac, interestingly, gets immediately tied up with Hollywood. Roman Polanski decides that he's going to do his own investigation of the Zodiac killing, and he hires psychic Peter Herkos. This is crazy. I'd never heard this. And the events were held. Herkos was involved in organizing a black arts festival, Halloween 1969, with Timothy Leary and Anton LaVey. That's a new one to me. Anyway, so Dave argues that the military boot that was supposed to be part of the evidence of who the Zodiac guy was
was issued to naval soldier personnel. So that would suggest, again, military-related hits, which that makes sense. I mean, there was a call-in show where supposedly the Zodiac called in, but who knows? I mean, this could just be people were just making this stuff. I think even that movie with Robert Downey Jr. and Jake Gyllenhaal, and Mark Ruffalo, if you remember this, which is a pretty good movie. If you watch Zodiac, when it really gets popular, there was, people were just saying that they knew who the Zodiac was, like all these people. So this guy would probably just wanted ratings, like oh, the Zodiac's going to call in. He wrote a letter to our TV show. Yeah, right. Santa Cruz starts having a lot of deaths, and this is supposed to be connected to, this is the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, connected to Zodiac. And what's interesting about this is that Santa Cruz, so they were finding a lot of dead animals too. So there's this explosion of Satanism and occultism and ritual sacrifice. And here's a new detail. The notion of the Age of Aquarius was popularized by San Francisco groups like the Diggers, who occupied the aforementioned Devil House, and by publications like San Francisco's Oracle. No one played a greater role in popularizing the Age of Aquarius than the Oracle magazine's Gavin Arthur. Interestingly, Arthur's full name was Chester Allen Arthur, and he was the great-grandson of President Chester Arthur. He predicted, supposedly, JFK's assassination before he was even elected. However, some attribute this to clairvoyance, while it is much more likely that he had foreknowledge. Interesting, yes. Just like there was a movie called Manchurian Candidate, where a mind-controlled patsy attempts to assassinate presidential candidate before JFK was assassinated. Yes, go watch John Frankenheimer's Manchurian Candidate. So, let's see here. Moving on to the next section.
Married after all. Despite all the talk about the 80-year-old Manson preparing to marry a 27-year-old woman, I know you've been following this case, and Manson has now said that he will allow the couple's marriage license to expire. Why? Because it turns out that the woman who was preparing to marry Manson wanted to place his remains, once Manson dies, in a glass crypt and sell tickets for people to view it. See, you knew there was a reason a 27-year-old was marrying him. Apparently, Manson doesn't like that idea, and so he's pulling back, letting that license expire. The New York Post also reports that Manson is angry at the idea because he believes he is immortal.
No, I I just added this in because it's so ridiculous, and I couldn't help it given that we're talking about serial killers, and we're going to finish up here with the rest of Dave's analysis, and then I'll give my analysis. But I did a video a few months ago, one of the first videos that I started doing consistently, and I talked about Manson and the hype of race war and all this kind of stuff. And if you watch that video, if you go back and it's about 30, 40 minutes, you'll see that there's a clip in there where Manson goes on and on about global warming and climate change. So, this guy is obviously some kind of total tool. I mean, he's not even coherent enough to do anything other than, I guess, parrot back whatever. I mean, the guy's just totally insane, obviously. But the thesis, of course, of Dave McGowan and others is that these guys were used, and they've been used by larger networks and so forth, and that, as Dave thinks, there may be, instead of mafia, the way we used to think of various crime families and so forth, that now it's kind of been replaced by this satanic network of cultists. And it's not so much these big crime families that we, the Godfather and this kind of stuff. It's still the mafia model, but it's just a different kind of face that's being used. Now, we mentioned Henry Lee Lucas, and we mentioned, now there's also the case of, we mentioned Zodiac and the oddities there. There's also the case of Arliss Perry. And Arliss Perry was the young girl who was murdered at college, and she had Masonic imagery drawn upon her body, carved into her the square and compass, and her legs were put into a square and compass formation, and I think a candle had been inserted into her vagina, from the altar. And this happened, this murder was done on a church grounds inside the chapel at Stanford Memorial Church at Stanford University. So, assuming that this story is true, then this would be another case of ritual murder. There's a cult compound that the Mansons had, and Dave spends a whole lengthy chapter on Manson and all the weird Hollywood people hanging out with Manson, and connections to the Esalen Institute, which we've talked about many times, where in Monterey you have this big New Age UN type cult compound that was connected to Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley and all these characters, and that they also ran a Himalayan academy that had direct ties to Charles Manson as well. So what's funny about the Manson thing is that he doesn't fit the serial killer profile because he didn't actually kill anybody. So the story, the mainstream story we're supposed to accept, is that Manson brainwashed, these followers, these groupies, and he was into this apocalyptic, processed church stuff. Basically, we're just going to cut through all the bullshit and say that this was all run by something even bigger, is the main point. Some bigger cult, again, just like Berkowitz and others. And this is why we have these kind of handler characters like Timothy Leary, these popularizers who are going around promoting the LSD. And Dave, dives into that with the character of Owlsley, another one of these creators and promoters of LSD. In Laurel, Weird Scenes Inside Laurel Canyon, he goes into a lot of depth there. And how many of these people were all connected to the CIA? So a lot of these were drug hits, and we have the Eyes Wide Shut style parties with the Manson crew as well. I think Dennis Hopper mentioned this going on. Dave discusses this on pages 142 and 43, and that bears out other writers who've written on this. Peter Levenda in Sinister Forces trilogy discusses the same claims, the same topics. And so really what we have with Manson is a character who, I think, as we said, what military and prison, the giant prison complex, is also tied into the military complex, and that's also tied into the psychiatric complex. And what happens is that these characters are profiled and spotted and then used for different purposes, maybe a contract killing, as we said, maybe to kidnap kids or people for human trafficking. And what we see pretty consistently is that we can raise questions about a lot of the psychiatric institutions and rehab centers as possible programming locales. And that's even come up in pop fiction. If you watched True Detective Season 2, that seems to hint at the Esalen Institute, as well as Thomas Pynchon's Inherent Vice, with the film version as well, with Joaquin Phoenix. Both of these seem to show this high-level mind control type stuff and these shadowy CIA type figures in the background. So we always see these contradictions pop up, and this is what is noted here by Dave on page 145. He says, it defies explanation that men such as Manson or Jim Jones or David Koresh have all stumbled upon the secret of brainwashing and mind controlling their followers, but the CIA does not have this ability. So, right, the mainstream story is a flat-out contradiction, because they always say that these cult leaders and serial killers and whoever, that they have all these powers of mind control and brainwashing, but at the same time, the establishment says that the CIA was never successful and did not really perfect these mind control brainwashing programs. So, again, obviously that's a bunch of baloney. So 24 people were killed in the 1970s by, we're told, by insane asylum people that had been released from the Vacaville facility. Now, why would they release all these nutcases from Vacaville? Well, probably as part of this larger American domestic version of the Phoenix program. And what he talks about in the last sections of the book is that the thesis is that the psychological warfare pattern that was tested in Vietnam on the Viet Cong, the whole point of it was just to scare the crap out of the Viet Cong and make them lose morale and break their will. And that is exactly what makes perfect sense in terms of understanding that program in terms of the U.S., right? In terms of American domestic experience over this several decades of what is supposed to be all the serial killers everywhere. So we get more characters like Herb Mullen. This is a guy who apparently had multiple personalities, and he went into the Marines and was going to be a killer, and he went into this kind of a assassination type program. And this is reminiscent of Full Metal Jacket, this guy. And apparently he went to some locale in Maui, Hawaii, which is reported to be one of these facilities where they train assassins. And if this sounds too far-fetched, remember in the 80s and prior to that, we had the whole story of the Latin American death squads, right, where the CIA set up these training camps for death squads, which would by extension also be connected to the Phoenix program, right? This idea of training professional assassins and basically psychos who, because they're psychos, lose their mind eventually, right? So now you might say, well, but I thought you said that there weren't programmed assassins. Now that's some people's view. That's not my view. What I always said was that there are both. They did all these programs and they ran all these tests during these periods, right, from the 40s to the 50s, 60s, and this includes all the psychiatric stuff, all the hypnosis, all the drug testing, basically what we call MK Ultra. All of that was done, and it eventually morphs into electronic implants and biowarfare, DARPA, right? This is the last chapter of John Marks's book. So that's all an outworking of that, and it's really just controlling the human domain, right? We remember this program that was mentioned in connection to Jade Helm a couple of years ago. Really, that's the same idea of what MK Ultra was about, right? The totality of human experience, which is not just the individual psyche, but also the collective sociology, collective psyche as well. So the argument then would be that what happens is when you study the individual cases of these different characters, these different psychos, and how to entrain them and depattern them and then reprogram and so forth, the stuff that you and Cameron was doing, that leads to various ideas of what you could do to the mass psyche, and that's the role that mass media plays. And so that's my view of it. My view of it is that they did all these situations with actual guys and actual people, and hence Doug Valentine's book Phoenix Program, and then in the Latin American death squads and all this kind of stuff. And then what was more useful than, just a contract killer or some crazed guy that you could get to kidnap people or whatever, because that's millions and millions of dollars involved in organ harvesting and human trafficking, right? So, but all of that data, that information, all the studies that were done could then be used for large-scale social engineering. And you say, well, who would be interested in that? Well, think about the RAND Corporation, right? The RAND Corporation would be interested in taking all that data, collating it, and figuring out, well, how could we use this for the so-called war on terror, you see? So the same ideas of basically inducing threat and terrorizing the public with Cold War and serial killers and assassins. And by the way, the serial killer stuff actually ties well with the Cold War assassins stuff, and right, because of Sirhan. We're supposed to believe he was this, trained occultist assassin, and he went after RFK, and Lee Harvey Oswald, he's a programmed assassin that the Soviets sent, right, according to the mainstream story, I'm saying. Right, and so this is right. Well, this is all a lot of baloney, obviously, and I doubt that we'll ever really know the full story of either of those cases. But I can guarantee you that what we're told in the official story is not true. And anyway, so what we're starting to see is the patterns of certain locations, like the Vacaville facility, which appears to be, involved very heavily in this, according to Dave's argument. We're seeing the pattern of a lot of these guys who are very messed up are into necrophilia, and then they tend to have alternate personas. They tend to have even perhaps demonic issues on page 157. Now, it's not all secret DARPA voice-to-skull technology, which some people would say, who had some people commenting on the introductory video that I made saying, this is stupid, none of this is real. No, I don't know what planet you guys are from, but I mean, have you ever been around crazy people? I have. And I'm talking about people who, have had serious psychological problems. I've had them in my family, not me, but family members who have been prescribed serious psychoactive drugs, who've been on these for a long time. I've had friends on these who go nuts, try to commit suicide. This is not all fake, and if you honestly literally think that it is, I don't know what planet you live on or where you're from. I mean, I've seen people in my family try to kill themselves from these kinds of drugs. So I'm just speaking here of like the psychiatric, antidepressant type stuff. And, in my younger days, when you be around people who are on drugs and partying and whatnot, and you just see people go nuts and something else takes over. And if you think that that's all fake, well, number one, that's a mental problem on your part. It's not all fake. If you think that it's merely something random or chaotic, and you don't think that the establishment has studied this stuff, well, then you're just naive. But we think of movies that tie into this kind of stuff, which is interesting because Natural Born Killers, Quentin Tarantino, Oliver Stone film that actually deals with this notion. It points out the absurdity of how the mainstream media actually makes the serial killers into stars. And then that was done on purpose. That was not just ratings and sensationalism, but also, as we said, to really prop up the mythology of the serial killer. Another pattern that Dave notices is what he claims that, I'd never heard of this, but he says that there's this idea in training people to be killers or assassins of blooding, and that it's the same idea that that pimps use when they break people. When pimps break their hose, blooding is the idea of traumatizing a person who might be a future assassin early on through some experience of the gruesome, right? So maybe they work at a morgue and they're constantly seeing cadavers, or they, like the stories that we hear about traumatized youth that they have their dog, like maybe they're in a cult and the cult kills their dog in front of them, and this traumatizes them when they're a kid. I think this is true. I know somebody who had something very traumatic happen to them when they were very young. In this case, it was accidental when they were about 4. And as a result, they have had very serious problems with lack of empathy, and I guess you might consider it like mild psychopathy as a result of a youth traumatization. And I think that it's, the prevailing literature that I've read on this tends to say, oh, well, it's a defense mechanism that the brain enacts. And I think that makes sense. That seems to line up with my experience. But Dave goes back into mentioning some of the guys that we've touched on many times who've studied alters and all this stuff with Dr. Estabrooks and his hypnosis work, and people that have studied DID and NPD, and then he mentions the False Memory Syndrome Foundation again as the primary characters who deny ritual abuse, and they are of course connected to the CIA, very shady characters. Colin Ross has a lot of information on this that's really good, critiquing these characters. He mentions the Symbionese Liberation Operation as some kind of psyop, either a CIA psyop research or something kind of a large-scale psychological warfare operation that really got the SWAT team stuff going. The SLA incident and the Charles Whitmore incident at the University of Texas, if I recall, are the instances he lists as really kicking off the call for local police departments to be completely militarized and in some degree federalized, and to start having these SWAT teams. And then we move on to, and also necrophilia is interesting as a consistent pattern, which is interesting because there's this weird obsession with sex and death that probably is what made these guys profiled at a younger age. And this is really what the whole institutional system, medical system, all that it kind of exists to, education system, right, to find these kinds of psycho freak weirdos, again, who can be used. So this goes on with, maybe these guys were sent to, they're abused, and then they're known for necrophilia or some kind of weird practice like this, and then maybe they're sent to an institution to be, counseled or whatever, and then this gets flagged, right? So, here's a guy, we found one. He likes gay sex, he likes killing animals, he likes necrophilia. He could be very useful, right? This kind of idea to the dark side of the deep state. And this brings in the character John Wayne Gacy. And John Wayne Gacy was connected to local police. He was like this adjunct cop, and he was using that cop, status to get access, I guess you could say, and cover to the local gay boys, and bring them in and rape them and torture them and kill them. And then what we have is the weird instance of him meeting with as a Democratic Party dude, very well connected apparently in the Chicago area, if I recall. There's a lot of details here. Sometimes it's difficult to recall every one of these details as to who's in where and what doing what. But Gacy was a very prominent JC. And so his connections to the JCs, which is one of these local, Rotary Club type things, that helped him have cover, as well as his connections to the police. And apparently, and this was actually in the movie presentation too, there's a TV movie with Brian Dennehy playing Gacy that is worth watching. It's not a great movie, but it's like 4 hours long, but kind of roughly follows the arguments that Dave makes, and that shows what it doesn't show is that Gacy claimed to have an alternate personality named Jack Hanley, who would take him over and commit the killings, and that there possibly were other police involved, and that this is why it was covered up for so long. Right, so it wasn't just, in other words, it might have been a situation where there was a prostitution ring of boys and drugs, and maybe local officials were involved, including Gacy, and so this is why it's covered up. And then anytime there was a threat of somebody ratting or trying to expose it, that would then lead to the murder, you see. That's a possibility. And it's kind of hinted at in the movie. If you watch the Henry Portrait of a Killer movie from, I don't know, like 1990 or somewhere in there. And it's hinted at that the higher ups, like the police chief and these other guys in the big city area, they were covering it up, or they were trying to squash the investigation of the local police. So interesting connections to investigations done by the private investigator, the famous Hollywood private investigator Anthony Pellicano. And Pellicano was, I'm trying to remember how he says he was connected to Gacy. Following the disappearance of one of Gacy's employees, Greg Godzik, Gacy was not questioned by police. Godzik's frustrated parents turned to help to Anthony. Okay, so they went to Anthony Pellicano. Anthony Pellicano never checked out Gacy and later claimed that he had never been given this name. Godzik was reportedly seen very much alive after his reported abduction, as was one other victim of Gacy, John Sezik. And one of the bizarre coincidences that seems to surround many serial killer cases, the Godzik home was burglarized the night before the story of John Wayne Gacy's arrest hit the airwaves. The family of victim Rick Johnson was convinced that Rick was abducted by Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church, an organization heavily steeped in mind control and with connections to South Korea's CIA, or the KCIA, which was set up by the CIA. So that's interesting because, the Moonies, we know the Moonies have these connections to the Bush family, and then obviously a mind control CIA type thing. And then we get to Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, of course, has these weird fetishes, and he is connected to, he was a young GOP, a rising young GOP. Ted Bundy is supporting Nelson Rockefeller, as we mentioned. I'm thinking of Dahmer. But both of them are rising GOP guys, right? Skulls were found in the case of Ted, and this is where the FBI comes in and sets up the Ted Squad. And this is really kicking off this FBI pattern of or promotion of looking for this serial killer. And Ted Bundy says, there's others in on this, of course, but they're not ever explained or mentioned. No photos were apparently allowed in the prosecution of Ted, which is interesting because Dave argues that might have implicated other police, other officials who were probably involved with Ted, but we don't know. California, Texas, Florida. This is the standard areas of the serial killers. And then, of course, Chicago, I guess, as well. These are, of course, known drug and mob areas. So another one of these characters that pops up, serial killer, sicko, pedo, self-mutilation, Gecht. What is this guy's name? Robin Gecht. And he is a multiple personality guy who was probably abused, and he was into bestiality, which, by the way, you can see now that the promotion of bestiality, which is happening in university sex shops on campuses, by the way, they're promoting bestiality. You can find those articles online at Campus Reform and other sites. You can see that the promotion of bestiality, which I believe Adorno talked about, this is all towards the depersonalization and dehumanization of society. So the serial killer stuff is very close to that Frankfurt School type toxic culture stuff, because the promotion of the whole serial killer mythos and ethos, as we just saw this chick in the video clip with Ben Swan talking about how she wants to marry Manson. Obviously she's wanting to make money from it, because she's going to, put his remains in on display or whatever. But what's interesting is that in the case of Gecht, for example, we have another instance of Satanism. And so the idea here is that Gecht may have been connected to the Ripper Crew, another one of these outfits that's famous for killing a lot of people. Another character, the Sunset Strip murder, was Navy Lieutenant Franklin Clark, who's gave birth to Doug Clark. And another series of Doug Clark, another bunch of sickos, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, it's kind of gross to continue talking about all these guys and their practices, but what's funny is that they get sent to, a lot of times, these military and medical facilities because of their, part of the VA or whatever, because they're former military guys, which could suggest, programming and whatnot. And that also could suggest the Phoenix program, which Dave McGowan mentions in the case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. And what's interesting about Ramirez is that there's all this oblivious, occult, black magic stuff that was even in the mainstream news, but it's just kind of been, oh, well, that's just, the proclivities of him as an individual eccentric weirdo. But why does it keep popping up? And could it suggest, more? I mean, maybe the 40 deaths attributed to, I guess, Ramirez, maybe he wasn't the only one doing that, right? And I mean, do you really expect people in some sicko cult not to frame some idiot in their cult, right? So if they find, like, if you have a cult and you're doing something like drug trafficking or human trafficking, the same as the situation with the that I mentioned with Gacy and the JCs and the cops, right? What are you going to do? Like, you understand criminology, you know how to get away with things. So what might you do? Well, you might find some dupe who gets interested in your cult, and you realize, man, this dude is effing nuts, right? He was probably abused. Maybe you have cult members that know about him, family members, they know about, oh, this my cousin Richard, he's a total nutcase, right? And this was the case with Richard Ramirez. Was his uncle or somebody knew about him, and right, so he kind of roped him into this network, and then you get him and you use him for whatever your purposes are. And then if it comes up that, he's caught, or he screws botched job, or he screws something up, well, then he takes the heat for all the killing, right? And meanwhile, you've been using him, and you've been indoctrinating him and telling him that, you're the enemy of our cult is XYZ, and he's going to rat us out, for whatever. So, in other words, you dupe these people because they're nuts. They have no idea what's going on. they probably do have altars, right? So they serve a purpose, is what I'm trying to say. And if people in the establishment know all this, then if the cult or the group or whatever has members in the establishment, then that's how these things could be covered up. Now, another one of these characters who he mentions, some of the guys who are into collecting body parts, the collector, this type of gross stuff. The collector, I didn't realize this, but I've read John Fowles' famous novel, which if you do grad studies in literature, it'll be on a list that you're supposed to read, The Magus. And I read The Magus, and I've mentioned it in my book, and this is because it suggests the idea of very rich people being able to engineer large-scale psyops. And John Fowles apparently wrote another book, though, called The Collector, which is about some psycho who likes to collect things. Or he doesn't just collect like butterflies and staple them to a corkboard or something. He collects. He starts with that, and then I guess he starts collecting body parts. And so this guy, what's this guy's name? This crazy. First one, Gary Heidnik is the next person, and Gary is connected to. This is one of the downsides of Dave's book, is that it goes through so much information that I kind of get lost in who's who. So then there's like these other guys, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, which I guess is like Filipino or something. But these guys were filming bondage porn and then apparently got into snuff films. And the idea was that, they were being used by a larger network. And I think then the Heidnik character was also had multiple personalities. And then we come to the next guy, Bobby Berdella. Bobby Berdella was a military guy, and he got into, I can't remember if maybe he wasn't military. Apparently he was just a hood, and then he got into body parts and cannibalism, sort of eating people. And he set up a house of horrors, and Bobby Berdella, let's see. Okay, so the CIA people come in to try to solve this case. Yeah, Bobby Berdella was kind of doing the same thing as Gacy, except he was grabbing boys, drugging them, and raping them, and torturing them. And supposedly one of them got away. And then we've got Leonard Lake and Charles Ng are drugging people and doing the same thing. And then Geraldo, if you remember his videos and his report, which I've watched those. Those are interesting. Where they covered the occult crimes in late 80s, early 90s, satanic panic stuff. And Geraldo actually brings up some of the esoteric and occult stuff in relationship to Bobby Berdella, and then two people, the CIA guy Troy Cole and Michael Aquino, come on Geraldo and debunk it and say, no, none of that exists. That there's no such thing. Which is preposterous, but this is what Dave says. So another interesting thing that I'd never heard, Dave says that Roy Radin of the Cotton Club murder, this is direct connect to Hollywood, was killed by a ritual execution, shot repeatedly in the head by 3 of magazine publisher Larry Flint's former bodyguards. And one of them was Charles Manson associate Bill Mincer. So here you have the connection to high-level porn, the Cotton Club murders, and then, Gary Heidnik, as I said, So he's a vet, and what's interesting about him is that he becomes this United Church of God, some church of the ministers of some weird Protestant evangelical sect, and that he sets up as he's the minister of it, a bishop, and he sets up torture dungeons, and he works at some mental health facility, and he starts kidnapping retarded black women, and he tortures them in the dungeon. And Gary, Dave claims, was used in military LSD experiments. This is pages 258, 259. And this was at a site in Germany, and it's the same locale that other supposed killers were. Paramilitary guys were trained, we're told. So, interesting. Now then we come to Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer gets the connection. He has the weird connections to high-level GOP people when he's young. So his senior class trip, Jeffrey Dahmer was somehow able to make a call on a payphone, and he gets his entire senior class a VIP tour of Walter Mondale's office and a visit by prominent writer Art Buchwald. How would this aspiring young GOP serial killer boy have such impressive contacts in Washington has never been explained. And here we come again with the gay bars and the gay guys and the necrophilia, and there are stories, at least there's reports of Dahmer was possessed, and people thought he was actually possessed, and that he had these alternate personas, and he would watch movies like Exorcist 2 over and over and over, and he would like rock back and forth watching them, and he was into eating the dead, and the only thing that the media had a tendency to talk about was a dabbling in Satanism, but Dave says that it was more than a dabbling, but they just covered this up. And next character, Herb Baumeister, another young GOP Navy-connected kid, has all the same ritual abuse case of connections to, military programs of killers and so forth. And so the thesis, again, the patterns that are here, that should be pretty obvious, but I guess if you're mainstream media and you don't know any of this stuff and you think that there's no such thing as alters in DID and MPD, and if you don't believe in evil, then you're going to be already preconditioned to not think that this stuff is real, and what you do accept as real is going to be conditioned by what you've seen in pop culture in the movies. Which, what happens in the movies is that they'll take some of the real stuff and then they'll like focus and draw the attention over to away from the occult stuff at times to just the lone crazy guy, or they don't raise the questions about connections to high up level officials. This, by the way, was was detailed in the first season of True Detective, where this weirdo redneck inbred family, or cousins of the family, they take the hit, the fall, and meanwhile the very wealthy, well-connected sickos don't get in trouble. That's mentioned at the end of season 1 of True Detective, which I do recommend, by the way. Now, the profilers and the patsies in this concluding section, Dave makes the argument that, look, this was basically a lot of funding, right? The whole serial killer phenomena. It was great for Hollywood, box office sales, book sales. It was a source of a lot of police bureau, getting funding, FBI getting funding. And really what it was a larger psychological warfare operation. And it's perfectly mirrored in Phoenix program, the death squads, and it serves the private prison industrial complex, which makes sense because a lot of the military contractors, maybe they go from military, then they go into private prison security work. And so, obviously you're going to have a lot of corrupt, sicko people in there. And that makes perfect sense. And the whole idea of profiling, this whole so-called science, which doesn't really make sense. It's not very consistent, according to Dave McGowan. I'm not saying that there's not profiling. There is. There are profiles to killers, but the FBI bureau, right, that's set up, Bureau of Scientific Bureau, or I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there's some behavioral science unit, BSU, that's it, that's set up as a result of this. It doesn't have the best record, according to Dave. And I'm going to pass over the JonBenet Ramsey section. I did read that, but you have to, that was just so weird. I don't know what to make of it. It looks like it's probably some kind of elite pedo sex ring. You can read that and make your own judgment there. Sean Helton also has a lengthy analysis, I believe, that he wrote at 21st Century Wire covering the JonBenet Ramsey case. And again, what do we see? Satanic ritual abuse, covered up. One guy I want to mention at the end who's curious is the character of Jean Baudel Bocassa, who was apparently the puppet of French intelligence in Central Africa, and he set up the Central African Republic, and he declared himself emperor. And you should go watch that. I watched 2 or 3 documentaries on this guy who is just so ridiculous. He was a cannibal, which was interesting. Bokassa would have these lavish parties in the palace, and they would eat people. He would eat his enemies and people that he conquered. And reportedly, when he went to Libya, he fled when his empire collapsed. He fled to Libya, and they still had eating people parties, cannibal parties there. So you get into the realm of the billionaires, okay, and the so-called elite, and they're into this really sick stuff. And there are billionaires, they do exist, and they do like sick stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised after reading Dave's book if it's not really like Hostel, if it's not really like Lone Survivor, remember that movie with Ice-T, where they get people and they hunt them from the 90s, something like that. I think maybe him and Gary Busey or somebody crazy. That's what we're looking at here is elite depravity, elite degeneracy, deviance, something that we've talked about a lot at Jay's Analysis. And why do we talk about that? Well, because it shows the abusiveness of the system and the establishment, that the people at the tip top tend to be bad guys. They're not there to help you or protect you or save you. Now, does that mean that that's because of hierarchy itself? I don't think so. The problem isn't hierarchy. The problem is human depravity. The problem is humans are fallen. And the reality of evil and the reality of spiritual evil, this is my conclusion on all this, points us back to God. It points us back to the Bible. The world that the Bible presents, is a world where demons are real, angels are real, spirits are real. They influence our world, our reality, and there is good and evil. And the modern world says all of that's stupid, that doesn't exist, ha ha ha. And then here we are confronted with the reality of evil and these kinds of cases of, organ trade and cults and human sacrifice and war and all this stuff. And the response is either denial or the lame, pathetic, empty attempt to try to explain it all through psychiatric problems and throwing chemicals at it. But you're never going to solve a spiritual problem in human beings with chemicals. And that's why all the pharmaceutical stuff doesn't work. It might work in a sense to maybe put people in a dazed catatonic state or something to where they're not able to go nuts because they're so drugged, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? It just treats the symptoms. Right? The symptoms are of of man's wickedness and depravity is that he is fallen, right? The source of the problem, I'm saying, is that he's fallen, and these evil acts are outworkings of that, and when they manifest in these very extreme cases of depravity, it really is just showing us the reality of spiritual evil. But any society that can't recognize spiritual evil, and I would say that that's societies that are, the reason that we have so many material blessings in the West, that we feel like all that stuff doesn't exist anymore, right? That was the ancient world, medieval world, had all these superstitions. And then here we are faced with real sickos, and people say, oh, well, it's just all fake. These idiots on the line that claim it's all fake. It's not all fake. There's real evil in the world, real spiritual evil. And again, why is there all the denial? Well, because the admission of it would lead back to the conception of God, right? If there's spiritual evil that's admitted to exist, then there's probably a God too. And that's what no one in the modern world can admit or stand to admit. So, Programmed to Kill: The Politics of Serial Murder. Highly recommended book. I would say that 90% good. A couple criticisms of the book. Dave doesn't go into female serial killers. There are plenty of those. You can go... I've looked this up, by the way, online, the quote profiles, or the cases of female serial killers. There was that one movie with Charlize Theron playing that one crazy bitch. I forget her name, but there's also black guys that were serial killers. He does mention the Atlanta kidnapper killer guy, Wayne Williams, I think is his name. So that's a black guy. But in other words, what I'm getting at is that we have this impression that, the serial killers are all these middle-aged, creepy white guys. That is not true. Now, a lot of these serial killer guys have tended to be the middle-aged white guy, because a lot of guys who would have gone into the special ops, Phoenix program type stuff, were probably more intelligent, trained in special forces type stuff, right? So, I mean, you can't just be a brute, right, and get into special forces. You also have to have like a certain level of IQ and so forth. So that would exclude a lot of minorities. But when we just consider the brutality of serial raping, murder, torture, there are plenty of cases of minorities involved in that, including Hispanics, including blacks, including women, including Asians too, by the way. So this is not a racial issue, I'm saying. But what's funny is that if you go to, like, I was doing this a year ago when I was researching some of this, I went to Psychology magazine, and when you look up what psychologists pop thing, right, that talks about serial killers, they literally tell you that it's all white males. I'm sorry, but there are, for example, there are women who've had multiple abortions. I would count that as a serial killing, right, based on my worldview. But no, that's not taken into account when Politically Correct Psychology Today magazine says that serial killers are all white dudes, middle-aged white dudes. No, it's been, and the problem, the issue there is that sin and evil are not race specific. All the races, all of the tribes of man are prone to temptation and evil. And now you could argue that certain people groups and races might be prone to certain evils. You could argue that, but there are wicked white dudes in power just as much as there are wicked people in Indonesia and Malaysia, having weird sex parties. Everybody knows about Singapore and Malaysia and all the sex stuff there. I mean, it's just really gross, sick stuff, right? I mean, this goes on everywhere. I know a girl who was involved in DJing for very large techno parties in Japan. And I believe her when she says this, but she talked about some of the stuff that the Japanese rich guys were into. I'm not going to repeat it because it's so gross. Now, she didn't say she did this, but she had been to parties where really gross stuff went down, which I won't mention. It's just nasty. But you can imagine that. I'm talking about millionaire, billionaire guys that are into stuff to do with human feces. Okay, so I mean that, and in a way, that's, I guess, quote, sort of tame compared to the idea of actually just killing people and murdering them, all of which is just disgusting. But still, this is what we're talking about. So it's not hard to believe when you consider, what other kind of stuff people who they have all the money in the world. They don't need, they just kind of move to the next sick thing, right? It's like the sickest to the sickest. And when you look at the art world of the so-called elite, that's a good window into that world that we're talking about here, that it's not hard to believe. They're into some very gross, bizarre stuff. So anyway, that all to me suggests the reality of the spiritual world. And we're going to continue to see wickedness of this nature, and it will get even worse and worse and worse until we realize that there is a God and the Bible is real. Here's this book that actually seems to explain all this very well, but nobody wants to believe that. They want to believe ridiculous, stupid things. So you've been listening to Jay's Analysis. Thank you, subscribers. You guys are the best, and I love you guys, and please continue listening and praying, and maybe we can bring some sanity to an insane world.
Come on in at night. I go on home, just sit tight.